According to one single report from over the weekend, the Atlanta Braves are interested in adding lefty reliever Tanner Scott to the back end of their bullpen. Let's talk about it. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Monday, December 30th. Your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsey Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. I hope your holiday week went well. Obviously, we did not do some shows in the middle of the week last week. I am currently, those of you on YouTube can see this, I am currently in Columbus, Ohio, traveling, visiting family right now. So shout out to my brother-in-law's basement office down here. And I wanted to make sure that we discussed some of these Braves needs over the weekend, because we got a little bit of news. We never get news directly out of Atlanta's front office about players that they are interested in. This front office has just decided the best way to do business is to not tell anybody anything until the deal has been signed and they can announce it themselves. We all see, we have the tweet notifications turned on. We see the Braves put out a tweet with that familiar blue box that they've signed this player to this kind of deal with 1% going to the Atlanta Braves Foundation. And so it was really interesting when David O'Brien of The Athletic, one of the three main beat writers for the team, along with Mark Bowman of MLB.com, and Justin Toscano of the AJC, when David O'Brien made a couple tweets, I believe it was on Saturday afternoon. Timing might be weird. He was in California. It was kind of like lunchtime for him. But about lefty reliever Tanner Scott. He went on about some of the predictions, the projections for his contract, how he wasn't signed. And somebody asked David in a tweet, are you saying that because the Braves have interest? And unlike usual, when David O'Brien only responds to negative tweets, David O'Brien says yes. So David O'Brien is saying the Atlanta Braves have interest in Tanner Scott. It's not really worth discussing how he found this out. He was at the winter meetings. It's possible he had a conversation with somebody in the org who said, yeah, we met with Tanner Scott last week. Or I think this about Tanner Scott. We did the research on him. We have no idea where he got this from, okay? But we also have no reason to assume David O'Brien's making this up. I feel like it's comfortable to say he's one of probably 3 or 4 people that if he's putting out there that the Braves are interested in Tanner Scott, we legitimately can believe the Braves are interested in Tanner Scott. And so I want to talk about this because Atlanta's one of the few teams that has yet to sign a major leaguer to a guaranteed major league deal, right? They've brought players in for the 40-man roster. They traded for Davis Daniel. They traded for Nick Allen. They've signed players to non-guaranteed deals and given them 40-man spots. Brian De La Cruz, Carlos D. Rodriguez, both going to be in the outfield mix to open the year as of now. And they've addressed the bullpen, right? They've brought in players on minor league deals. They've brought back some of their own guys. They've addressed the bullpen, but not in a meaningful way when it comes to getting a lefty or getting a back-end guy. And the reason that you need both a lefty and a back-end guy is because given some of the injuries and things like that you're still dealing with on Angel Perdomo, I don't expect him to be back to start the year. He hasn't faced live pitching or hasn't faced live hitting yet. It's reasonable to think your only lefties after AJ Minter walked in free agency, your only lefties who are locks to make the opening day roster, Dylan Lee and Aaron Bummer. And while I think both of those guys deserve to be used in higher leverage spots than they were used last season, we don't know for a fact that Brian Snitker is prepared to do that. At the same time, you also are faced with not having Joe Jimenez available to start the year. He was your primary setup man for closer Raisel Iglesias. He was scheduled to have a small cleanup procedure on his knee after the year. That became a much more extensive repair than was expected. And he is expected to miss most, if not all, of the 2025 season. On its surface, it makes sense that Atlanta would be interested in Tanner Scott. He's a lefty. He's a back end reliever. He gives you there's a lot of reasons to like it. So let's go through these. Let's talk about the pros and let's talk about the cons of signing Tanner Scott. And if the contract proves to be more than they want to do, which so far there has not been a lot of willingness to do some of the contracts we've seen in free agency so far. It's possible the fact that the reliever market is very slow and a lot of these guys are still unsigned as we're about to tick into 2025 on the calendar means maybe the money won't be as bad as we think. But let's talk about it. So, what you need to know about Tanner Scott is the last 2 years have been very good to Tanner Scott. 2023 entirely with the Marlins, best year of his career. 9-5 record, 2.31 ERA, 74 games, 78 innings pitched, 104 strikeouts to 24 walks, picked up 12 saves. Very good year for Tanner Scott. The strikeout rates were really there. A lot of the peripherals were really good. 2024, his ERA actually came in lower than 23, but the strikeout rate was down a little bit. The walk rate was up a little bit. Really interesting year there, right? 9-6 with a 1.75 ERA. 72 games, 72 innings. He didn't really do a lot of multi-inning work that year between the Marlins and then being moved at the deadline to the Padres. 84 strikeouts to 36 walks. So equivalent innings, 6 less innings, but he went from 24 to 36 walks and 104 strikeouts to 84 strikeouts. Did pick up 22 saves, but not as ERA was better, not as good of a year in the overall underlying metrics that go into ERA. And reliever ERA can be skewed so much by one bad outing. ERA alone is not the best way to evaluate a reliever. But again, let's talk about some of these pros. I think the very first one is we do have to acknowledge he does check off multiple boxes of need for you. He's a lefty. Obviously, again, AJ Minter, as of now, is not back for 2025. He's still a free agent. So he does give you another lefty in that pen, and ostensibly one that Brian Snitker would trust with high leverage opportunities almost right away. Whereas, again, Aaron Bummer and Dylan Lee, in my mind, have been worth it, but they haven't necessarily received all of those opportunities that they should receive. High leverage as well, obviously, slots right in there. He probably starts the year as your setup man to Raisel Iglesias. To go along with this, something I've talked about on this show before is the Braves needing more velocity out of the pen. Another thing for Tanner Scott, average four-seam velocity last year, 97 miles an hour. Him and Daisabel Hernandez would automatically be the two hardest throwers in that bullpen. And Daisabel Hernandez is another guy who the team has expressed belief that he can pick up a higher leverage role than he got in his 16 games last year. So right there, you've added two relievers, if Tanner Scott does come on board, that give you high velocity and should be able to work in the late innings. They have belief these guys can work in the late innings, right? Scott could be your ancillary closer. I've talked about this before, how the Braves the last couple of years, except for 24, have had that former closer that was in their pen that could be their backup guy if they needed somebody to go out and get a save, right? Kirby Yates, I think, did a great job of that in 23 when he was coming back after Tommy John. And in retrospect, maybe you should have picked up the Kirby Yates option for 24. It worked really well for the Texas Rangers. The con here, the flip side of this high velo profile for Scott and really for Hernandez as well is the walk rate. Tanner Scott's walk rate last year was 12.2%. It was the 7th percentile for all pitchers in baseball. Relievers are inherently a little bit wilder than starters for the most part, but 12.2% walk rate is not great. And you can see in a lot of the peripherals in 23, that walk rate was a lot better than in 24. It was a 1-year reduction in walk rate, and a lot of it came back in 24. So really interesting there. And then you have to figure out here how much of his past struggles are things that we need to be worried about. Prior to 2023, so his entire career up until 2023, Tanner Scott's career ERA was a 4.61. Was a 4.61 entering 2023. He had those two amazing years. Again, ERA was better in 24, but I feel like he was a better pitcher in 23. Wasn't walking guys as much. Strikeout rate was higher. Walk rate was much lower. I believe he converted more saves as well for a Marlins team that made the postseason and then got rid of almost everybody over the next calendar year. So when you're looking at Tanner Scott, yes, the walks are an issue. I will say, though, last year in 2024, a lot of the other stuff that goes into being a high leverage reliever, he did really well. And in a Braves kind of trend, right? Spencer Schwellenbach's good at this. Max Fried was very good at this. Tanner Scott doesn't get hit very hard. The average exit velocity off of Tanner Scott last year was 84.3 miles an hour. That was 100th percentile in baseball. That means nobody in baseball gave up consistently less hard contact than Tanner Scott. Guys are just not hitting his fastball slider combo. Yes, he's in StatCast as having thrown a single changeup last year. It is the first changeup of his entire career. When you go pull the video, it looks like an accident. So it's a fastball slider only profile. But both these pitches graded out really well. They do really well. He doesn't really have platoon splits either. 167 in the last 2 years against lefties, 194 average allowed to righties. So not significantly worse to righties than to lefties. But continuing on the theme of not getting hit hard, right? 92nd percentile in barrel rate, 99th percentile in hard hit rate. His ground ball rate is over 50% for his career. So Tanner Scott is a high velocity lefty that may walk too many guys, but doesn't give up a lot of hard contact, does not give up a lot of much worse contact to righties, and is a guy that should be able to fold into the back end of your bullpen, is largely matchup proof and can hold down the 8th inning for you, and should be able to step into the 9th inning if you need him to. Now, there are some cons outside of that walk rate issue about Tanner Scott, and we'll get to those next right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsey Crosby talking about the report over the weekend from David O'Brien of The Athletic that Tanner Scott, lefty reliever, formerly of the Marlins and the Padres, is a Braves target this year in free agency. Real quick before we do that, I want to give a shout out to our friends at In-Case Cards. They make custom trading cards. In this case, I gave each of my kids a custom trading card from In-Case Cards. My son plays baseball, plays t-ball. Really, he's that young. My daughter plays soccer. They both got custom trading cards of themselves for Christmas. In-Case Cards took the source photos that I provided from their team pictures, added in positions, stats, did a whole custom design for each kid, backgrounds, graphics, everything else on there, printed them on high-quality cardstock, slabbed them, and shipped the slabs to us. They have stands built into the slab so it can stand up on a kid's dresser. Both of my kids, probably the most excited they got of any gift at Christmas was these custom trading cards, playing cards from In-Case Cards. So go to ncasecards.com, ncasccards.com to check out their options and order yours today. So when we're talking about Tanner Scott, I think the big thing that's going to come up here for a lot of people is, what is Tanner Scott going to cost? Okay. Because the reliever market has been surprisingly quiet. We've only seen a couple relievers sign multi-year deals. Most of them, I talked about this last week, have a mitigating circumstance. They're going back to their original team. Clay Holmes is converting to a starter, things like that. And so you're in this weird thing of, I don't know what the contract's going to be. On the one hand, it's safe to assume that the deal is going to maybe be smaller. Some of the predictions we got entering free agency, Tim Britton of The Athletic and David O'Brien had this in his tweet. Tim Britton of The Athletic had 4 years and $64 million for Tanner Scott. MLB Trade Rumors had 4 years and $56 million. Another factor that could help alleviate some of the cost is you think about the fact that there's probably less competition than expected for the very top end of relievers in free agency. When you look at the fact that the Yankees traded for Devin Williams, the Phillies, instead of going after one of these top end guys, signed Jordan Romano to fill their bullpen, their closer vacancy, and they're pretty much done. So you're in a situation where theoretically you would hope you could get a discount on Tanner Scott because the reliever market has not really moved and there's not as many options to the Braves would be bidding against to sign Tanner Scott. But the flip side of that is a little bit of unknown as well. You're in a situation here where it is known across baseball that Raisel Iglesias is in the final year of his deal. He's making $16 million in 2025. He is a free agent after this season. And so the ability to sign Tanner Scott to a multi-year deal with the understanding that he would be the closer after Raisel Iglesias, he's the closer in waiting, is very appealing. But I imagine that Tanner Scott's representatives also know that. So they're going to want to be pricing him as a closer. And do I think he's going to get similar money to Edwin Diaz and Josh Hader? I do not. But it's entirely likely they'll want to get him a multi-year deal at closer money versus a multi-year deal at setup man money. Simply because, one, Devin Williams will hit the market next year, I believe, and he will be the number one reliever target. So you don't like Tanner Scott's not going to want to do something with an opt-out. The Braves don't do opt-outs anyway. They don't like opt-outs. But Tanner Scott's representatives are going to say, we don't care how you use him. He's going to get paid like a closer. We don't care if you use him as a closer or not. Like once Josh Hader signed that deal in Houston, he pretty much pitched however they want him to pitch. He didn't care because he already got paid. That's the situation here. Tanner Scott's going to get paid. And he feels like he's probably one of the safest options in free agency, despite the pre-2023 struggles, despite the walk rate being so high last season. And I understand the concept of if you can't make additions to your rotation, which Atlanta has not been able to meaningfully do this offseason. They've brought in guys, right? They've brought in pieces who can sit in the minors, who can be called up for spot starts. We've gone through the list. It's double digits now of guys who you could see start games in 2025. But they haven't made, no doubt, slam dunk meaningful additions for the rotation. It makes sense that the flip side of that strategy would be to do what the Guardians have done, to do what the Tigers did last year and just say, okay, we're going to beef up the bullpen and we're just going to be more aggressive about getting into the pen if we need to mitigate for a below average or a struggling starter that maybe can't go 6 innings, right? He doesn't have the stuff to get through the third time through the order. We can throw him 4 or 5 innings. We can get to the bullpen early and let them close the game out. Now, on the Guardians note, I will point out you saw what that accumulated workload ended up doing in the postseason, right? I want to say Emmanuel Clase allowed more runs in the postseason than he did in the entire regular season. And a lot of that bullpen struggled because they were used so heavily during the year. So you don't necessarily want to bank on aggressively going to the pen all season. But you can see how Alex Anthopoulos not being able to find the deals that he's been looking for in free agency or in trades for starters means he could pivot and beef up the pen, because either way, you've got to cover the innings. And does it really matter if you cover them on the front end or the back end, as long as they're covered? That's the philosophy here. I will remind you, it's not too late to add a meaningful starter. The Chris Sale trade was a year ago today. A year ago on December 30th is when the Braves acquired Chris Sale. So it is by far not too late to add a meaningful starter to this team. But as of now, they have not done it as of time of recording here on Sunday evening in Columbus, Ohio. So I get the idea of beefing up the pen, right? I understand the logic behind this. You'll have Pierce Johnson still, you'll have Bummer, you'll have Lee, you'll have Daysbel Hernandez, obviously Raisel Iglesias, Tanner Scott would fold into that. And then you've got a bunch of other options of guys that may get in there. Angel Perdomo, come back later in the year, all these different guys, right? Grant Holmes, eventually we assume is going to go back into the pen once Spencer Strider is back. We're just assuming I've operated as if Ian Anderson and Grant Holmes are 4 and 5 to start the year, and Holmes can just kick back to the rope to the bullpen. So it makes sense. The flip side of this is this a good use of the money? Okay. You can make the Tanner Scott signing and stay under the luxury tax. Okay. But I'm not concerned about the CBT in this situation. There's reportedly like $23 million. There is no way Tanner Scott would get a deal large enough from Atlanta to take Atlanta into the CBT by himself. Not going to happen. But the two questions I have are, one, what does adding Tanner Scott mean for your ability to then go out and sign an outfielder in spring training like you did at Adam Duvall last year? You got a good deal. I want to say it was like $3 million. Obviously didn't work out. He was not effective at all last year. And then we have to keep in mind, too, that A likes to keep money for additions at the deadline. So out of having $23 million to spend, you're probably not wanting to go over $18 million this offseason because you want to have $4 or $5 million to make those adds at the deadline. So can you add Tanner Scott and not have, and still be able to meaningfully address the outfield if a situation comes up and still stay under the luxury tax? Because to me, we've discussed this before, to me, the worst case scenario on the CBT here is to spend all offseason trying to stay under it and then ending up $2 million over. Because you had most of the downsides with not spending money, not acquiring new talent, all of that stuff, but you didn't get the benefit of resetting it. Like, who cares that the tax is only $1 million or whatever? The tax isn't the bad part. It's the fact that you would then go into 2026 still having not reset the tax. And if you wanted to take the spending back to 24 levels, you would still be paying a 50% tax. So what does adding Tanner Scott do to your ability to address as things come open? Guys are always non-tendered in spring training or give an indication they're going to be let go or whatever. What does adding Tanner Scott now, let's say it happens the night of the 30th, what does that do to your ability to go out and grab those guys and still reset the tax? And then two, is having the highest paid bullpen in baseball giving Atlanta the value that it should? Last year, that was the highest paid bullpen in baseball, $45.98 million. They barely beat Philly for number one. In 2025, as of time of recording, the Braves are expected to be the number two bullpen in baseball, 43.10 behind the Phillies, because the Phillies, again, added Jordan Romano. You subtracted AJ Minter, who was making $5 million, something like that. That's top of my head. I don't have it here with me, but he was making millions of dollars. And so your bullpen right now, you've got 5 guys making double-digit millions before Tanner Scott would be added. So Iglesias making $16 million, Joe Jimenez making $9 million, Pierce Johnson making $7 million, Aaron Bummer making $3.5 million, Dylan Lee making $1.98 million. The rest of that is the minimum salary guys and things like that gets you to $43 million. In 2023, they were 5th highest. Is that a good use of your money? Your rotation was so good last year that arguably you didn't need to have the highest paid bullpen in baseball to still close out a lot of these games. Now, it helps that you had them. Raisel Iglesias probably single-handedly preserved quite a few wins for you that looked like they were going awry late in games, but they weren't perfect. And by a WAR perspective, other bullpens were better. Cleveland's bullpen was better from a WAR perspective. And so is it a good use of your money to say we're going to give a 6th guy in this bullpen a multi-million-dollar guarantee. Because typically, and Dylan Lee was the exception last year, typically you don't option those guys back down. So if you have 6 guys all making multiple millions of dollars in your bullpen, for the most part, you're not going to be able to option them down to the minors. Most of them don't even have options. Dylan Lee still had an option. That's why he was the one chosen to go down for 2 weeks. And you saw the Braves suffer without him for a little while there down the stretch because AJ Minter was already out at that point. So they were low on lefties. So is it worth giving yourself the highest paid bullpen in baseball and not having the flexibility to move guys around just to get Tanner Scott into the back end mix and then have him as your potential next closer if Raisel Iglesias is not re-signed? And I do think you can structure this deal. The AAV accounts for this somewhat, like the tax hit accounts for this somewhat, but you can structure the cash to escalate in year 2 and on after Raisel Iglesias' $16 million is up and after Marcell Ozuna's money is up too. So you can structure the deal to pay him more after year 1 when Raisel Iglesias' money frees up if you don't re-sign him. The CBT is always done off of the average annual value. So if it's 40 million over 4 years, it's going to be bigger than that. I'm just trying to do simple numbers here. That's 10 million AAV, even if you pay him 2 million in year 1. It's a $10 million AAV. That's how you calculate the CBT numbers. And that's why Atlanta's CBT numbers are always higher than the cash payroll, because so many of these long-term deals escalate in money as you go farther down until these guys hit that $22 million threshold that the Braves are always under. Because at the end of the day, the Tanner Scott money could go to multiple options in the pen. If you want a lefty, you don't have to sign Tanner Scott. You can re-sign AJ Minter. You can bring AJ Minter back. Assuming he's healthy, you may even get a discount on AJ Minter if he's able to stay back in Atlanta and not have to uproot him. I believe he's married, so uproot him and his wife and move them somewhere else. Will Smith, who won you a World Series in 2021. He is a free agent after Kansas City. His deal with Kansas City ran out. He did not make a 4th consecutive World Series, but a guy named Will Smith did make the World Series again. So you could always bring in Will Smith, try to recapture some of that magic. Andrew Chafin, I believe formerly the Diamondbacks. He's an option out there. Ryan Yarborough is out there. You can find lefties. You can also find high velocity guys. Carlos Estevez is available. Joe Kelly, assuming his right shoulder injury is healed, kept him out of the World Series. Assuming that's healed, you can add velocity if you want in the back end at a price that would be cheaper than Tanner Scott, and you get a little bit of that edge that Joe Kelly has. I love that fire, that competitiveness, the being willing to taunt an opposing hitter who looks bad. That's a little bit of that dickish quality that some fans have said the Braves roster doesn't really have. Chris Sale gave you a little bit of it. Joe Kelly could give you a little bit of it. So you have options. And the question is, would you rather sign Tanner Scott to 4 years, $64 million? Or would you rather bring in a guy like AJ Minter, bring him back, and a guy like Joe Kelly? Or would you rather sign one of those guys and an outfielder? That's the situation you're in, because until further notice, I'm going to assume the goal is to reset the CBT. So I'm going to assume you're not going to go over that. As frustrating as that might be. And we'll go back and we'll look at the end of the year. If there was a signing that would have been a slam dunk that put them over and they don't get the job done in 25, we can talk about, hey, in retrospect, that was a bad call, not resetting the CBT. But that's the decision the Braves have to make here. And obviously, we don't know which way the Braves are leaning. Is there a price they're comfortable with for Tanner Scott? Is there an amount that once it hits this, they don't want any part of it? We don't know. But hopefully we'll find out soon. This has been Braves Today for Monday, December 30th. If you're listening on audio, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell when we drop that next episode. And until next time, this has been Braves Today.